This is a very special recording, one of the most happiest mood pieces ever put to tape and available to very privileged listeners today. I'd like to read out aloud the history, the background and recording, and subsequently the critical response to which shifted over the years toward Miles Davis's 1969 classic, In a Silent Way. By January 1969, Davis' core working band had stabilized around Wayne Shorter on soprano saxophone, Dave Holland on bass, Chick Corea on electric piano, and Jack DeJohnette on drums. For his next studio album, Davis brought in former band members Tony Williams on drums as he wished to use his style, and Herbie Hancock on additional electric piano, as they had previously agreed to work with Davis on studio recordings. In the following month, the six were joined by Austrian keyboardist Joseph Zoinel, after Davis had called him and asked him to bring musical ideas for the group. An English guitarist, John McLaughlin, who had been in the United States for less than 2 weeks to join the Tony Williams lifetime before Davis asked him to attend the recording session. McLaughlin had been a longtime fan of Davis and spoke of his nervousness to the trumpeter about the prospect of recording of his idol. Among the pieces by Zoinel that Davis took a liking to was In a Silent Way, an atmospheric piece that was titled at the suggestion of Julian Cannonball Adderley when the two were in the same band. Adderley wished to use the piece for his own recording, but Zoinel turned him down after he learned that Davis wished to use it. Although Davis' live performances in the recent albums Miles in the Sky 1968 and Phyllis de Kilimanjaro 1968 had indicated his stylistic shift towards electric instruments and jazz fusion, In a Silent Way featured a full-blown electric approach by Davis. It has been regarded by music writers as the first of Davis's fusion recordings, while marking the beginning of his electric period. It is also the first recording by Davis that was largely constructed by the editing and arrangement of producer Tia Macero, whose editing techniques have incorporated elements of classical sonata form in Davis' recordings for In a Silent Way. Both tracks on the album consist of 3 distinct parts that could be thought of as an exposition, development, and recapitulation, with the first and last third of each track being the same piece. In a Silent Way was assembled from takes from a 3-hour session from Studio B at CBS 30th Street Studio in New York City on the February 18th, 1969. Shh, Peaceful was composed solely by Davis, while the opening and closing section to In a Silent Way, It's About That Time, is based on Zoinel's In a Silent Way, which he would record in its original form in 1970 for his third solo album, Zoinel, 1971. After Zoinel, I don't never know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and I've heard it pronounced before, presented the tune to the group. It was rehearsed as it was originally written, but Davis wished for it to sound more rock-oriented and stripped the various chord changes to leave a more basic melody, allowing the band to play around it from a single pedal point. McLaughlin had some difficulty playing in the manner Davis wished of him, but found his way after the trumpeter suggested he played the guitar as if he were a novice. Davis maintained the belief that Zoinel was never happy with his adaptation and believed the album would have been less successful had its original arrangement been kept. Zoinel had expressed some irritation towards the rearrangement, in particular of 2 chords that he believed Davis was wrong to remove, as the piece lacked a greater climax than it could have had if they were retained. Zoinel claimed he was responsible for the melodic bass line and descending melody to It's About That Time, but was not credited. He blamed Macero for this, as he always put things together so it came out as if Miles had written it, but that's not correct. 2 days after the February 18th session, Davis returned to the studio and put down Ghetto Walk with drummer Joe Chambers, which he intended to include on In a Silent Way with Shh, Peaceful, but it was later swapped for In a Silent Way, It's About That Time. The group also played through Early Minor, another Zoinel piece, on the day, but eventually scrapped it. And how was the reception? Peaking at number 134 on the US Billboard Top LPs chart, In a Silent Way became Davis's first album since 1965's My Funny Valentine to reach the chart. And My Funny Valentine was a compilation, I believe? Live album, excuse me. While it performed better commercially than most of Davis's previous work, the album's critics were divided in their reaction upon its release. Its incorporation of electric instrumentation and experimental structure have been sources of extreme controversy among jazz critics. According to the Rolling Stone Album Guide 1992, Davis's recording process and producer Tia Macero's studio editing of individual recordings into separate tracks for the album seemed near heretical by jazz standards. In his book Running the Voodoo Down, The Electric Music of Miles Davis, Phil Freeman writes that rock and jazz critics at the time of the album's release were biased in their respective genres. Writing rock critics thought In a Silent Way sounded like rock, or at least thought Miles was nodding in their direction, and practically wet themselves with joy. Jazz critics, especially ones who didn't listen to much rock, thought it sounded like rock too, and they reacted less favourably. Freeman continues by expressing that both reactions are rooted, at least partly, in the critic's paranoia about his place in the world, writing that rock criticism was in its early stage of existence, and such critics found reassurance in viewing the album as having psychedelic rock elements, while jazz critics felt betrayed amid the genre's decreasing popularity at the time. It didn't swing, the solos weren't even a little bit heroic, and it had electric guitars, but though In a Silent Way wasn't exactly jazz, it certainly wasn't rock. It was the sound of Miles Davis and Tia Macero feeling their way down an unlit hall at 3 in the morning. It was the soundtrack to all the whispered conversations every creative artist has, all the time, with that doubting, taunting voice that lives in the back of your head, the one asking all the unanswerable questions. So says Phil Freeman. If you're wondering why I'm leaving out Lester Bang's quotation here, it's on principle. Davis's next fusion album, Bitches Brew, showed him moving even further into the area that lay between the genres of rock and jazz. The dark fractured dissonance of Bitches Brew ultimately proved to be instrumental in its success. It far outsold In a Silent Way. In a Silent Way has been regarded by fans and critics as one of Davis's best works. In a retrospective review, Blender writer K. Leander Williams called it a proto-ambient masterpiece. Citing it as one of Davis's greatest achievements, Chip O'Brien of Pop Matters viewed that producer Tia Macero's studio editing on the album helped Davis embrace the marriage of music and technology. In regards to its musical significance, O'Brien wrote that In a Silent Way transcends labels, writing it is neither jazz nor rock. It isn't what will eventually become known as fusion, either. It is something altogether different, something universal. There is a beautiful resignation in the sounds of this album, as if Davis is willingly letting go of what has come before, of his early years with Charlie Parker, with John Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley, of his early 60s work, and is embracing the future, not only of jazz, but of music itself. Stylist magazine writer Nick Southall called the album timeless and wrote of its influence on music, stating the fresh modes of constructing music that it presented revolutionized the jazz community, and the shifting, ethereal beauty of the actual music contained within has remained beautiful and wonderful. Its echoes heard through the last 30 years, touching dance music, electronica, rock, pop, all music. One of the most impressive and effectively ethereal recordings available, In a Silent Way, is a great blessing from the history of human art. There ought to be a CD of In a Silent Way, as well as a player, obviously, in every hotel room, or a free streaming service, whatever needs to apply these days, In a Silent Way, stabilizing the mood.